Maybe your day has been longer than you expected. Maybe you've spent hours surrounded by noise, people, responsibilities, and thoughts that never seem to slow down. But for a moment, you don't have to think about any of that. Just imagine the sound of waves moving gently beneath a wooden ship, the quiet movement of the sails above you, and a distant coastline slowly disappearing into the darkness. 10 years of war are finally behind you. And for the first time in a very long time, you are going home. This is where Odysseus found himself. Troy had fallen. The Great War was over. The armies were leaving. And somewhere across the sea was the small island he had spent 10 years dreaming about, Ithaca. There was only one thing Odysseus wanted now: to see his wife again, to see the son he had left behind as a child, to walk through his own home, to finally live a life that belonged to him. After everything he had survived, the journey home should have been simple. But the sea was not finished with Odysseus, and neither was fate, because the man who had survived the greatest war of his age was about to begin a journey that would become far more dangerous than the war itself. His ships would cross unfamiliar seas, his companions would disappear. He would encounter strange islands, monsters, sorcery, and the realm of the dead. He would lose almost everything he had, and yet, through every storm, through every temptation, through every moment when returning home seemed impossible, one thought would remain with him: Ithaca. So tonight, let the noise of the world become distant. Imagine yourself standing quietly on that ancient ship, with the Mediterranean stretching endlessly around you, the wind moving softly through the sails, and the ruins of Troy fading somewhere behind you. The war is over. The journey home has begun. And somewhere beyond the darkness, Ithaca is waiting. But before Odysseus can reach it, he must first sail toward a foreign shore, a shore where his journey will take its first unexpected turn, the land of the Cicones. For 10 long years, Troy had been the center of Odysseus's world. Its walls had stood between armies. Its towers had watched kings arrive and disappear. Its gates had opened for soldiers and closed against their enemies. And now, those walls were broken. The great city that had resisted the Greeks for so many years had finally fallen. The war was over. Across the ruined streets, fires still burned beneath the night sky. Smoke drifted slowly upward from buildings that had once belonged to wealthy families, merchants, warriors, and kings. The sounds of battle had finally disappeared, leaving behind something almost unfamiliar to the men who had spent so long surrounded by it. Silence. Odysseus stood among the ships preparing to leave. Around him, his men gathered whatever supplies they could carry. Water was brought aboard. Food was stored beneath the decks. Ropes were checked. Sails were prepared. The wooden ships that had carried them through years of war were now being turned toward a completely different purpose. They were no longer ships of war. They were ships going home. And for Odysseus, that word meant more than it could have meant to anyone else. Home, Ithaca, the small island kingdom in the Western Sea. It was far from the glory of Troy, far from the enormous armies and golden palaces of powerful kings. But to Odysseus, none of those things mattered. He had spent 10 years fighting for Helen, for honor, for alliances, and for the Greek cause. Now he wanted none of it. He wanted his own land. He wanted the hills of Ithaca. He wanted the familiar coastline. He wanted to see Penelope. And somewhere in his heart, he wondered what his son Telemachus had become. When Odysseus had left Ithaca, Telemachus had been only a small child. Now, after 10 years of war, the boy he remembered would have grown into a young man. Odysseus had missed the years when a father normally watches his child grow. He had missed birthdays. He had missed ordinary mornings. He had missed the quiet moments that never appear in songs about heroes. And perhaps that was what he wanted most. Not another victory, not another kingdom, just an ordinary life. As the final preparations were completed, Odysseus looked once more toward Troy. The city had given him victory, but it had also taken much from him. Friends had died. Warriors had disappeared. Men who had once laughed beside him were now buried beneath foreign soil. The victory was real, but it was not without a cost. Eventually, the order was given. The ships began to move. Oars entered the water. Wooden hulls pushed away from the shore. The sails slowly filled with wind. And Troy began to disappear behind them. For the men aboard the ships, there was a feeling of relief. They had survived. They had defeated Troy. They had endured a war that had lasted for an entire decade. Now the sea stretched before them. Some men imagined their families waiting on distant shores. Others dreamed of food, rest, and warm beds. Some simply wanted to stop fighting. Odysseus wanted Ithaca. Nothing else. At first, the journey seemed almost peaceful. The ships moved together across the water. The wind carried them away from the ruined city. Behind them was Troy. Ahead of them was home. But the sea between those two places was enormous, and Odysseus did not yet know how long that sea would hold him. He could not know that the journey he imagined would take days or weeks would eventually stretch into years. He could not know that storms would scatter his fleet. He could not know that some of the men sailing beside him would never see their homes again. He could not know that strange islands would tempt his companions, or that some of the most dangerous enemies he would face would not be armies at all. For now, however, none of that had happened. The war was finished. The ships were together, and Ithaca was somewhere beyond the horizon. The men sailed on. During the day, the sun crossed the open sky. At night, the stars appeared above them. The sea rose and fell beneath the wooden hulls, and slowly, the distance between them and Troy grew. Odysseus had spent years learning how to win battles. He knew how to read an enemy. He knew how to plan an attack. He knew how to use deception when strength alone was not enough. But the sea was different. You could not command it. You could not negotiate with a storm. You could not threaten the waves into obedience. The sea would become one of the great forces of his story. Sometimes it would carry him forward. Sometimes it would hold him back. And sometimes it would take everything he had. Still, as the first days passed, there was reason to hope. The men had food. They had ships. They had experienced sailors, and they knew where they wanted to go. They were heading west, toward Ithaca, toward home. Then, after sailing for some time, they reached a distant coast. It was not Ithaca, but it appeared peaceful. The land beyond the shore was fertile. There were settlements. There was food. There were animals. And after the exhaustion of war, the sight of land must have seemed like a gift. The men had been traveling together for a long time. They were tired. They were hungry. And they had spent years living under the discipline of an army. Now that Troy had fallen, perhaps they felt that they had earned the right to enjoy themselves. Odysseus looked toward the unfamiliar shore. This was the land of the Cicones, and somewhere along this coast stood the city of Ismarus. The men did not yet know that their arrival here would become the first great mistake of their journey. They had survived Troy. They had survived 10 years of war. But victory had taught them something dangerous. They had become confident. They believed that the hardest part was over. They believed that after defeating one of the greatest cities of the ancient world, there was little left that could truly threaten them. And perhaps that confidence was understandable, but it would soon become their weakness. Because Odysseus was not simply sailing into a new land, he was sailing into the first test of his journey home. The ships moved closer to the shore. The men prepared to land, and ahead of them stood Ismarus, the city of the Cicones. For a while, the journey continued without trouble. The ships moved steadily across the sea, carried by a favorable wind. Behind them, Troy had almost disappeared from sight. The men could no longer see its towers. They could no longer smell the smoke rising from the ruined city. Soon, there was nothing behind them but the open sea. And perhaps, for the first time in 10 years, Odysseus allowed himself to believe that the war truly was over. There was no enemy waiting beyond the next hill, no commander calling his men to arms, no walls to conquer, only the sea and the journey home. During the day, the sunlight spread across the water, turning the waves bright beneath the ships. At night, the men rested beneath the stars. Some spoke quietly about Ithaca. Others talked about their families. There were probably stories of wives waiting at home, children who had grown older, parents who had become older themselves. The men had left as soldiers. They were returning as different people. 10 years of war had changed them. Some had become harder. Some had become quieter. Some carried memories they would never speak about. And some were simply grateful to be alive. Odysseus understood that feeling. He had lost many companions during the war, and yet, as he watched the remaining ships moving together across the water, perhaps he felt something close to happiness. The journey had begun. Ithaca was ahead. He only had to reach it. But the gods had other plans. The sea was vast, and the route home was uncertain. Odysseus and his men could not simply sail in a straight line toward Ithaca. The winds could change. Currents could carry ships away from their intended course. Unknown shores could appear before them. And every new coastline offered both opportunity and danger. Eventually, they reached the land of the Cicones. The coastline appeared calm. Beyond the shore was fertile countryside. There were fields, there were animals, and somewhere nearby stood the city of Ismarus. The men looked toward the land with interest. They had been traveling for some time, and they had supplies to gather. But there was another reason the shore attracted them. Ismarus was not simply an empty settlement. It was a city, and Odysseus's men were warriors. They had spent 10 years learning how to fight cities. They had spent 10 years following orders. And now, suddenly, there was no army commander standing above them. The war was finished. Their discipline had weakened. Their confidence had grown. They looked at Ismarus and saw an opportunity. Odysseus knew that they needed supplies. Food, water, perhaps livestock, perhaps other necessities for the long journey. But there was something else in the minds of some of his men. They had fought for years. They had sacrificed. They had watched others become rich from the spoils of war. And now they had found another city that appeared vulnerable. The temptation was difficult to resist. Odysseus and his men went ashore. The Cicones were caught unprepared. They were not expecting an attack from the men who had just destroyed Troy. The Greeks moved quickly. They overwhelmed the defenders who were near the coast and seized control of the settlement. The attack was successful. For Odysseus's men, it felt almost familiar. They had done this before. They had fought at Troy. They knew how to attack. They knew how to take advantage of surprise. And now they had won again. They gathered food. They took valuable possessions. They captured livestock. The men began dividing the spoils among themselves. There was excitement on the shore. After 10 years of war, victory felt natural to them. Perhaps some of them believed that this was simply another part of the journey home. They would take what they needed, rest for a while, and then return to their ships. But Odysseus understood something that his men did not. The longer they remained on the shore, the greater the danger became. The Cicones had been defeated, but they had not been completely destroyed. The people who had escaped had gone inland, and they were not going to remain there forever. Odysseus looked toward the surrounding country. There was still time to leave. The ships were nearby. The sea was open. Their supplies had been gathered. They had achieved what they needed. So Odysseus gave his men an order. Return to the ships. Leave the shore. Get back to the sea. Continue the journey. It was the sensible thing to do. They had already won. There was no reason to risk anything more. But his men did not listen. Perhaps they were tired of obeying orders. Perhaps they were enjoying the food and wine they had found. Perhaps they believed that the Cicones were too frightened to return. Or perhaps they simply believed that Odysseus was being overly cautious. They had survived Troy. They had defeated a city. Why should they be afraid now? So they stayed. Instead of returning immediately to the ships, they sat along the shore. They ate. They drank. They slaughtered animals. They celebrated their victory. And as the evening approached, the coastline became strangely peaceful. The men probably thought the danger had passed. But far from the shore, the Cicones were preparing to return. The people who had escaped Ismarus had not simply disappeared. They had run to the surrounding villages, and there they found help. The Cicones were not alone. They had allies. They had experienced warriors. And while Odysseus's men celebrated on the coast, those warriors were gathering. More and more of them arrived. They came from the surrounding settlements. They brought weapons. They brought shields. They came together under leaders who understood exactly what had happened. Their city had been attacked. Their people had been killed. Their possessions had been taken. And now the invaders were still sitting on their land. The Cicones were coming back, but Odysseus's men did not know it. The sea remained calm. The evening light slowly faded. And the Greeks continued to celebrate. Perhaps somewhere among them, a few men wondered why Odysseus kept looking toward the horizon. Perhaps he could already sense that something was wrong. He had spent years studying enemies. He knew that a defeated enemy was not always a defeated threat. And now the silence around Ismarus felt different. Too quiet, too peaceful. The men had won a battle, but they had forgotten something important. They were no longer inside the walls of Troy. They were far from their homeland. They had no army behind them, no reinforcements, no friendly city nearby. Their ships were their only escape, and their ships were waiting on the shore. Odysseus wanted to leave, but the men had chosen to stay, and while they drank and celebrated, the Cicones were coming down from the hills. By morning, the Greeks would discover that their victory at Ismarus had been nothing more than the beginning of their first great mistake. The journey home had only just begun, and already the sea was waiting to carry away the first of Odysseus's companions. Morning came quietly to Ismarus. The first light of dawn appeared beyond the hills, spreading slowly across the coastline. The fires that had burned through the night were beginning to fade. Around them, the men of Odysseus were still resting. Some had fallen asleep beside the ships. Others lay beneath the open sky. After the long years of war, they had become accustomed to sleeping almost anywhere. A patch of ground, the deck of a ship, the shadow of a wall. Wherever there was a little safety, they could rest. And after their victory at Ismarus, they believed they were safe. The night had passed without an attack. The city had been taken. Their enemies had disappeared. The men had food. They had wine. They had supplies. Their ships were nearby. To them, the danger seemed finished. But beyond the hills, the Cicones were already moving. They had spent the night gathering. The men who had survived the first attack had reached their neighbors. They had told them what had happened. The strangers had come from the sea. They had attacked Ismaros. They had taken their possessions. They had killed their people. And now they were still there. The Cicones were not going to allow the invaders to leave without a fight. Their numbers grew through the night. Warriors came from the surrounding countryside. They brought shields, spears, helmets, swords. They knew the land beneath their feet. They knew the paths through the hills. They knew the coastline. And most importantly, they knew that the Greeks were not expecting them. As the sun began to rise, the Cicones moved toward Ismaros. Slowly at first, quietly, then in greater numbers. The first Greek soldiers to notice them may have thought they were simply local people returning to the city, but soon they realized something was wrong. There were too many. Figures appeared along the hills. Then more appeared behind them. The distant movement became an army. And suddenly, the peaceful morning was gone. A warning spread through the Greek camp. The Cicones were coming. Men woke suddenly. Some reached for their weapons. Others ran toward the ships. Those who had been sleeping beside the fires looked toward the hills and saw the enemy descending. The confidence of the previous evening disappeared almost instantly. The men who had been laughing and drinking were now trying to remember where they had left their shields. Weapons were picked up. Armor was pulled into place. Orders were shouted. The camp that had been quiet only moments before became filled with confusion. Odysseus understood the situation immediately. They had stayed too long. He had warned them. The enemy had regrouped. Now they had to fight their way back to the ships. There was no time for another victory. There was no reason to defend the city. Their only objective now was survival. Odysseus called his men together. They needed to form ranks. They needed to protect the path toward the shore. And they needed to reach the ships before the Cicones could surround them completely. The first warriors came down from the hills. Then more. The Greek soldiers formed their lines. Shields came together. Spears were raised. For a moment, the two sides stood facing each other. The sea behind the Greeks, the hills behind the Cicones, and between them, the ground where the first battle would begin. Odysseus had fought countless battles. He knew the moment before combat. That strange silence, the hesitation, the final breath before men moved forward. And then, the Cicones attacked. The two forces collided. Shields struck shields. Spears moved through the gaps. Men shouted. The quiet coastline was suddenly filled with the sounds of battle. Odysseus's warriors fought hard. They were experienced soldiers. They had fought at Troy. They knew how to maintain formation. They knew how to protect one another. For a while, they pushed the Cicones back. The Greeks had better experience. They had survived years of warfare. And perhaps, for a brief moment, Odysseus believed they might still escape without terrible losses. But the Cicones had one advantage the Greeks could not overcome: numbers. More warriors continued to arrive. Every time one group moved forward, another appeared behind it. The Greek soldiers were becoming surrounded. The battle stretched across the shore. The men tried to maintain their formation, but the pressure increased. Odysseus shouted instructions. He urged his companions toward the ships. The sea was close. They could see the wooden hulls waiting along the coastline. If they could reach them, they could escape. But reaching the ships was no longer simple. The Cicones were fighting fiercely. They knew their land. They knew that if they allowed the Greeks to reach the sea, the invaders would escape. So they pressed forward. The Greeks were forced to defend themselves while retreating. And retreating while fighting is one of the most dangerous things a soldier can do. Every step backward creates another opportunity for the enemy. Every moment spent fighting gives the enemy more time to surround you. Odysseus's men began falling, one after another. Men who had survived Troy, men who had stood beside him for years, men who had dreamed of seeing their families again. Some would never see those families. The loss would come suddenly. A warrior who had been alive only moments before could disappear beneath the movement of the battle. Another would fall beside him. Another would be carried away. The war they thought they had left behind had followed them to the shore. Odysseus fought among his men. He could not simply remain safely behind them. He had to move with them. He had to keep them together. He had to prevent panic, because panic could kill more men than the enemy. He shouted for the warriors to hold their shields, to stay together, to keep moving toward the ships. Slowly, step by step, the Greeks began giving ground. The Cicones continued pressing forward. The shore became crowded with men. The smell of smoke and salt filled the air. The sound of the sea mixed with the sound of weapons, and through all of it, the ships waited. So close, yet still far away. Eventually, some of Odysseus's men reached the first ships. They climbed aboard. Others followed, but there were still warriors on the shore. The retreat became desperate. Men ran toward the water, while others remained behind to protect them. Some dragged wounded companions toward the ships. Others turned back to fight the Cicones. Every moment mattered. The Greeks needed to get away before the enemy reached the fleet. Odysseus knew that once they were aboard the ships, the battle would change. The sea could protect them. The Cicones could not easily follow, but they needed enough time to launch. Enough men needed to survive long enough to push away from the shore. The final groups began running toward the water. The Cicones followed. Some warriors reached the ships and pulled themselves aboard. Others climbed over the sides. The oars were brought into position. The sails were prepared. The men pushed against the shore. The wooden hulls began to move, slowly at first, then faster. The sea opened beneath them. The ships were finally escaping, but the cost had been enormous. The men looked back toward the shore. Ismarus was behind them, the city they had attacked, the land they had believed would provide an easy victory, the place where they had celebrated only hours earlier. Now it was the place where their companions had died. The men who remained aboard the ships were silent. There was little to celebrate. They had won at first, then they had stayed. Then the enemy had returned, and now many of their friends were gone. Odysseus watched the coastline grow smaller. He had warned them, but that did not make the losses easier. A leader carries the weight of his decisions, but he also carries the weight of the decisions made by the people who follow him. Perhaps Odysseus wondered whether he could have forced them to leave earlier. Perhaps he wondered whether he should have acted more strongly. Perhaps he simply looked toward the sea and understood that the journey had changed. This was no longer a simple voyage home. The sea had already taken its first payment, and they had barely begun. The ships moved farther from the shore. The Cicones slowly disappeared into the distance. The men who remained began tending to the wounded. Some sat quietly. Others looked at the empty places where their companions should have been. There were fewer voices now, fewer men, fewer friends. And the dream of returning home had become a little more fragile. The sun climbed higher. The wind filled the sails. The fleet moved westward again. But the men had learned their first lesson. A victory can become a defeat when you forget to leave. And a journey can become dangerous long before the greatest monsters appear. Odysseus had not yet met the Cyclops. He had not yet heard the song of the sirens. He had not yet entered the realm of the dead. Those dangers were still far ahead. For now, his greatest enemy was something much more familiar: the weakness of his own men, their hunger, their confidence, their desire for one more victory, one more meal, one more night on foreign soil. And now they were paying for it. As evening approached, the ships continued across the sea. The coastline disappeared completely. The men looked ahead. There was nothing but water, and somewhere beyond that endless horizon was Ithaca, the home they had been trying to reach. But the distance between Odysseus and Ithaca had just become greater. Not because the island had moved, but because the journey had become uncertain. The men had lost companions. They had lost time. They had lost some of their confidence. And the sea ahead was still vast. Odysseus stood quietly aboard his ship. The wind moved through the sails. The waves rose and fell beneath him. He could not know what waited beyond the horizon. He could only continue. So the ships sailed onward, carrying the survivors of Troy deeper into the unknown. And behind them, on the distant shore of the Cicones, they left the first graves of the long journey home. The ships continued westward. For a long time, no one spoke. The men were exhausted. The battle at Ismarus had taken more from them than they had expected. Some were wounded, others were grieving. And many of the men who had sailed away from Troy only days earlier were no longer aboard the ships. The sea carried the survivors onward. Behind them was the land of the Cicones. Ahead, nothing was certain. The men had once believed that their journey would be simple. They had imagined sailing away from Troy, following the familiar routes across the sea, and eventually seeing the shores of Ithaca. But already, that dream was beginning to feel distant. The sea stretched endlessly around them. The wind could change at any moment, and the farther they traveled, the less control they had over where they would eventually arrive. Odysseus remained watchful. He knew that the fleet had suffered. The ships were still together, but they were weaker than before. The men were tired. Their supplies had been reduced, and the confidence that had filled them at Ismarus had disappeared. Now there was only the quiet determination to keep moving, to sail, to survive, to reach home. For a while, the wind remained favorable. The sails filled. The ships moved steadily across the water. The men settled into the rhythm of the voyage once again. The wounded were cared for. Food was divided. Water was carefully measured. The ships were checked for damage. There was work to do, and work gave the men something to concentrate on. Still, the memory of Ismarus remained with them. Perhaps some men spoke quietly about those who had died. Perhaps others remained silent. There are some losses that don't need words. A man looks toward the place where his companion used to sit, and notices that the place is empty. He hears a familiar voice in his memory, and realizes that he will never hear it again. The sea has a way of making such thoughts feel even larger. There is nowhere to escape them. Nothing to distract the mind except the horizon. And the horizon never seems to move. Day followed day. The sun rose. The sun crossed the sky. Then darkness arrived. At night, the stars appeared above the ships. The same stars that had watched over Troy now watched over Odysseus. He had once used them to guide armies. Now he used them to find his way home. Perhaps he looked upward and thought of Ithaca. Perhaps Penelope was looking at the same stars. Perhaps Telemachus was sleeping beneath another sky. These thoughts gave him strength. Home remained the destination. Whatever happened, he had to continue. But the sea was not finished testing him. The weather eventually began to change. The wind that had carried the ships forward became less reliable. The water grew rougher. Clouds gathered in the distance. At first, They were only small patches of darkness on the horizon. Then they grew larger. The sky became heavier. The men noticed. Sailors know when weather is changing. They feel it in the air. They see it in the movement of the clouds. They notice the color of the horizon. And slowly, the sea began to change beneath them. The waves became less gentle. The ships rose higher and fell deeper. The sails pulled unevenly against the wind. Odysseus ordered the men to prepare. Ropes were secured. Sails were adjusted. The sailors moved quickly across the decks. Everyone knew what storms could do. A ship could survive a storm, but a fleet was more difficult. One ship could disappear into the darkness while the others continued. Another could be pushed far from its course, and once ships became separated, finding one another again could be almost impossible. Odysseus watched the horizon. The storm did not arrive all at once. It seemed to build slowly. The wind increased. The waves rose. The sky darkened. And then the sea became restless. The ships began to struggle. Men held onto ropes. The sails snapped in the wind. Water washed across the decks. The ships rose and fell beneath them. Odysseus could do little except guide his men through the danger. There was no enemy to fight. No city wall to attack. No army whose movements he could predict. This was different. The storm did not care about strategy. It did not care about courage. It did not care who had conquered Troy. The sea was simply the sea, and the men had to endure it. For a long time, the fleet struggled against the wind. The ships were pushed away from their intended course. The men tried to keep control. But eventually, the storm began carrying them wherever it wished. They were no longer truly sailing toward Ithaca. They were being carried away from it. And this was perhaps the beginning of the most important pattern of Odysseus's journey. Again and again, he would think he was moving toward home, and again, the forces around him would carry him farther away. The storm eventually weakened. The clouds began to separate. The waves slowly became calmer. The men were exhausted. But when they looked around, they realized something had changed. They no longer knew exactly where they were. The familiar route was gone. The fleet had been pushed far from its intended path. They were in unknown waters. Still, the ships remained afloat. The men were alive, so they continued. They followed the wind when they could. They watched the stars. They searched the horizon for land. They needed food. They needed water. They needed a safe place to rest. Eventually, land appeared. At first, it was little more than a faint shape in the distance. The men watched carefully. As the ships approached, the coastline became clearer. There were unfamiliar shores ahead, a strange land, a place they had never seen before. The men were relieved. After the storm, land was exactly what they needed. They could rest. They could search for food. They could refill their water containers. And perhaps they could finally understand where the storm had carried them. The ships moved closer. The coastline looked peaceful. There were no armies waiting, no walls, no signs of battle. Only a quiet landscape beneath the open sky. The men began to feel hopeful again. After everything they had endured, perhaps this place would offer them a little peace. They did not know it yet. But this land would become one of the strangest places they had ever encountered. Because the danger here would not come from soldiers. It would not come from storms. It would not come from monsters. It would come from something much quieter. Something sweet. Something that would make the men forget the very reason they were sailing. Home. Odysseus and his companions were approaching the land of the Lotus Eaters. The first ships moved toward the shore. The men looked at the unfamiliar coastline. They had survived Troy. They had survived the Cicones. They had survived the storm. And now, for the first time since leaving Ismarus, they believed they might finally be safe. But the journey home was about to become stranger than anything they had yet imagined, because sometimes the most dangerous temptation is not something that threatens your life. Sometimes it is something that makes you no longer care about the life you were trying to return to. For some time after leaving the land of the Cicones, the ships sailed in silence. The men had little to say. The coastline had disappeared behind them, but the memory of what had happened there remained. The battle at Ismarus had been brief, compared with the 10 years of war at Troy. And yet, in some ways, it felt different. At Troy, they had known they were going to war. They had known there would be battles. They had known that men could die. But at Ismarus, they had believed they were safe. They had believed the danger had passed. They had believed that the war was behind them. And that belief had cost them. The men who had died at Ismarus had not expected their final day to be their final day. They had expected to sail home. They had expected to see their families. They had expected to tell stories about Troy. Perhaps they had even imagined themselves sitting beside their homes, surrounded by people who would listen to everything they had experienced. Instead, their journey had ended on a foreign shore, and now the surviving men carried that knowledge with them. Odysseus understood this better than anyone. A leader can count ships. He can count supplies. He can count weapons. But he cannot easily count the weight of a man's absence. There were empty places aboard the ships now, places where familiar voices had once been heard. A warrior might look across the deck and instinctively expect to see an old companion there. But the companion would not be there. Only the sea, only the wind, only the creaking of the ship beneath his feet. The journey had already begun to change them. At Troy, they had been part of something enormous. Thousands of soldiers, great armies, kings, warriors from distant lands. At sea, there were only themselves, a small collection of ships surrounded by an enormous world. The sea made them feel smaller. The horizon stretched in every direction. There was no wall to protect them, no army to call upon, no city where they could retreat. If something happened now, they would have only one another. And perhaps this was the first moment when the men truly understood what their journey home would require. It would not simply require courage. It would require patience, discipline, restraint, and above all, the ability to keep moving. Odysseus knew this. He had always been a man who understood that strength was not enough. At Troy, brute force had rarely been the answer. He had survived through strategy, through patience, through deception, through the ability to think when others were already acting. Now, he needed those same qualities at sea. But there was something else he had to understand. He could not control everything. The Cicones had taught him that. He could warn his men. He could give orders. He could tell them when to leave. But he could not force every man to make the right decision. That was one of the hardest truths for a leader. A commander can point toward the right path, but the people following him still have to choose whether to walk it. At Ismarus, his men had chosen poorly, and some of them had paid with their lives. Odysseus could not bring them back. He could only carry their memory. The fleet continued across the sea. The wind was softer now. The waves rose and fell gently beneath the ships. The men slowly returned to their ordinary tasks. Someone repaired a damaged piece of wood. Another checked the ropes. Others prepared food. The wounded were treated. Life aboard the ships began to find a rhythm again. It was strange how quickly ordinary life could return after disaster. A man could spend one day fighting for his life, and the next day be repairing a sail. He could lose a friend and still need to eat. He could grieve and still need to work. The sea did not stop for them. The sun still rose. The wind still moved. The waves still touched the ships. The world continued as though nothing had happened. And perhaps that was one of the cruelest things about loss. The world does not always pause when someone disappears. It simply continues. Odysseus continued as well. He knew that looking backward would not bring the dead back. But he also knew that forgetting them would be another kind of loss. So he carried them with him. Their names, their faces, their voices, their mistakes, their courage. Everything that had happened at Ismarus would become part of the story he would eventually tell. But for now, the story was still being written. The ships moved farther west. The men watched the horizon. They searched for signs of land. They needed water. They needed food. And they needed a place where they could safely repair themselves and their ships. But there was something else happening as they traveled. The men were slowly becoming aware of how far from home they really were. Troy had been far from Ithaca, but at least Troy had been a place they understood. They had known its walls. They had known its roads. They had known where the enemy was. Now they were surrounded by a world they could not predict. Every cloud was a question. Every coastline was a mystery. Every change in the wind could alter their destination. They were moving through a world that was familiar to the gods, but almost completely unknown to them. And perhaps Odysseus felt that more deeply than anyone. He had promised his men that they would return home. He had promised himself the same thing, but a promise is easy to make when the destination is visible. It becomes much harder when the destination disappears beyond the horizon. Still, he refused to abandon it. Ithaca remained in his mind, even when the sea became dark, even when the winds changed, even when another shore appeared before them. Home remained home. The memory of it became a kind of compass. Not a compass made of metal or instruments, but something inside the mind, a direction, a reason, a purpose. Odysseus was not simply trying to survive. He was trying to return. And that difference mattered. A man can survive for a day. He can survive a storm. He can survive a battle. But surviving for years requires something else. It requires a reason to continue. For Odysseus, that reason was Ithaca, and for his men, it was the people waiting for them there. The sea continued beneath them. The ships moved through the afternoon. The sun slowly began to descend. The men watched the changing colors of the sky. For a short while, the clouds became golden, then orange, then darker. The water reflected the fading light, and once again, night approached. The men settled into their places. The stars appeared overhead. Odysseus looked upward. Somewhere beyond those stars was the land he wanted to reach. Perhaps he wondered how long it would take. Perhaps he wondered what would happen before he saw Ithaca again. But he did not know. No man could have known. The journey had already shown them that the future could change in a single moment. A peaceful shore could become a battlefield. A favorable wind could become a storm. A victory could become a loss. And a journey that seemed to lead directly home could suddenly carry them somewhere completely unknown. So Odysseus remained patient. He watched, he listened, and he waited for the next sign of land. The men had learned their first lesson. They could not afford to become careless again. The sea demanded respect, the unknown demanded caution, and the journey demanded patience. The ships continued through the darkness. Their sails moved gently in the night wind. The oars rested. The men spoke quietly. Some prayed. Some slept. Some simply watched the stars. And for a little while, nothing happened. No battle. no enemy, no storm. Only the endless sea. But calm does not always mean safety. Sometimes calm is simply the space between two dangers, and somewhere ahead, another change was already waiting. The winds would soon shift. The fleet would be carried farther from the route Odysseus had intended, and the men would begin to discover that the sea itself could become an enemy. They had survived the Cicones, but the Cicones had been a warning. The journey home would not be measured only by the distance between Troy and Ithaca. It would be measured by everything that stood between them. Every storm, every strange land, every temptation, every creature, every loss, and every decision. Odysseus had begun the journey believing that home was simply a place he needed to reach. Now he was beginning to understand that the journey itself would change him. The man who had left Troy was not going to be the same man who eventually returned to Ithaca. The sea would teach him that. The gods would teach him that. And the people he met along the way would teach him that. But for tonight, there was only the sea, the stars above, the quiet movement of the ships, and the distant hope of home. Odysseus stood watching the horizon. He could not see Ithaca, but he continued to believe it was there. And sometimes, when everything else disappears, belief in where you are going is the only thing that keeps you moving. The night passed slowly. Above the ships, the stars moved across the darkness, while beneath them, the sea continued its endless rhythm. The men slept where they could. Some rested beneath the shelter of the sails. Others remained awake, watching the horizon and listening to the movement of the water. There was something strangely comforting about the sea when it was calm. After the violence of Ismarus, the quiet seemed almost like a gift. But Odysseus knew better than to trust the sea completely. It could be gentle one moment and merciless the next. As morning approached, the darkness gradually faded. The eastern sky became pale. The first light appeared over the horizon, and slowly, the ships emerged from the shadows of the night. One by one, the men began to wake. The sailors checked the ropes. The sails were adjusted. The ships were inspected for damage. Food and water were counted once again. Every supply mattered now. They did not know how long the journey would last. They did not know where the next safe harbor would be. And they certainly did not know how much farther the sea would carry them before they saw Ithaca. Still, the fleet continued. The ships moved together as best they could. From a distance, they must have looked small against the enormous Mediterranean. A few wooden vessels, surrounded by water in every direction. The men aboard them had once belonged to a vast army. They had marched with thousands. They had stood beneath banners. They had heard the voices of kings. Now there were only a handful of ships, and the sea. The difference was enormous. At Troy, they had believed that numbers could protect them. If one man fell, another could take his place. If one unit became exhausted, another could replace it. If supplies ran low, more could be brought from behind the lines. The sea offered none of those comforts. Every man mattered. Every ship mattered. Every decision mattered. A mistake made by one person could affect everyone. And Odysseus understood that the smaller their fleet became, the more important discipline would be. He watched his men carefully. The grief from Ismarus was still there. But grief could not stop the voyage. The men had to continue working. They had to continue eating. They had to continue repairing the ships. They had to continue sailing. And slowly, the rhythm of life at sea returned. Morning, afternoon, evening, night, then morning again. The journey became a pattern. The sea, the sky, the wind, the ships. The same horizon. For men who had spent years fighting, This kind of existence could feel almost unreal. There was no city to conquer, no army to defeat, no clear enemy, only distance. And distance could be exhausting in its own way. At first, every man could imagine the end of the journey. Ithaca seemed like a destination that could be reached, but as the days passed, the island remained invisible. The sea continued, and the horizon remained the horizon. Perhaps some of the men began to wonder how far they really were from home. Perhaps they began to understand that they were not simply sailing toward Ithaca. They were moving through a world they did not understand. The wind could carry them toward places they had never heard of. The currents could pull them away from familiar waters. And if they lost their course, they might not even know how far they had traveled in the wrong direction. Odysseus remained focused. He watched the stars at night. He studied the direction of the wind. He listened to his sailors. He asked questions. He tried to understand the movement of the sea. But even the most skilled navigator has limits. The ancient world was vast. The waters were unpredictable, and there were no guarantees. A man could know the sea well and still become lost. As the days passed, the weather changed. The clear skies that had followed the battle did not remain forever. Clouds began appearing in the distance. At first, they were thin, almost harmless. But gradually, they gathered. The wind became less predictable. The sailors noticed. They exchanged glances. They watched the sails. They looked toward the horizon. Odysseus noticed too. He knew what changing weather could mean. He ordered the men to prepare. Ropes were tightened. The sails were adjusted. Anything loose was secured. The ships continued forward. For a while, the weather remained manageable. Then the wind strengthened. The ships leaned against it. The waves became larger. Water moved across the decks. The men held onto the ropes. The sky darkened. And once again, the sea reminded them that they were not in control. There was no enemy to blame, no warrior to defeat, no strategy that could guarantee victory. The sea simply moved. The wind simply blew, and the ships had to endure. Odysseus stood among his men. He shouted instructions when necessary. He encouraged them to remain calm. Panic would accomplish nothing. The ships needed to stay together. They needed to maintain control as much as possible. The men worked. They pulled ropes. They adjusted sails. They secured the ships. And gradually the storm passed. But when the sky cleared, the fleet was no longer exactly where it had been. The sea had carried them. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough. Their intended route had changed. They were farther from home, and once again, Odysseus had to accept something he could not change. The journey was no longer completely in his hands. This was becoming the pattern of his voyage. He could choose where to go, but he could not always choose where he would arrive. He could choose to sail, but he could not command the wind. He could choose to fight, but he could not command the outcome. He could choose to return home, but he could not control everything that stood between himself and Ithaca. Perhaps that was the beginning of Odysseus's greatest lesson. A clever man can control many things, but not everything. There are forces greater than any individual: the sea, the weather, the decisions of other people, the choices of enemies, and, in the world of the gods, the will of powers far beyond human understanding. Still, Odysseus continued, because the alternative was to stop. And stopping meant giving up. The fleet moved onward. Days passed. The men became quieter. The memory of Troy began to fade. The memory of Ismarus remained, and Ithaca became something almost dreamlike. They could picture it, but they could not see it. Sometimes a man would look toward the horizon for a long time. Perhaps he imagined land there. Perhaps he imagined the outline of his home. Then the image would disappear. Only water remained. The journey was becoming a test of patience. Not every challenge was dramatic. Some challenges were simply the passing of time. Days without land, nights without certainty, the same horizon, the same water, the same question: how much farther? For Odysseus, there was another question. What would happen when he finally returned? Would Ithaca still feel like home? He had changed. The war had changed him. The sea was changing him further. And the people waiting for him had changed too. Telemachus was no longer the little boy he had left behind. Penelope had spent years living without him. The kingdom had existed without its king. What would happen when Odysseus finally stepped onto the shore? Would everything simply return to the way it had been? Or would he discover that home itself had changed? These thoughts followed him, but he did not allow them to stop him. He continued watching the sea. The men continued rowing when necessary. The sails continued catching the wind, and the ships continued moving westward. Then, one afternoon, something changed. A sailor at the front of one of the ships noticed something in the distance. At first it looked like a cloud, then perhaps a bird, then land. The word moved quickly through the fleet. Land. Men stood. They looked toward the horizon. After so many days surrounded by water, even the smallest shape of land could create excitement. The ships changed direction slightly. The men watched. Slowly, the distant shape became clearer. It was not Ithaca, but it was land, a new shore, an unknown shore. The men were relieved. They needed supplies. They needed fresh water. They needed rest. Perhaps this place would provide what they needed. Odysseus watched carefully. He had learned from Ismarus. He would not allow his men to rush blindly into another unknown land. He wanted to know what waited there. Who lived there? Was the land safe? Was there food? Were there warriors? Were the inhabitants friendly? Every question mattered. The ships continued toward the distant coastline. The men prepared themselves. Some looked hopeful. Others looked cautious. Odysseus remained silent. He had learned not to trust appearances. A peaceful shore could hide danger. A beautiful landscape could conceal an enemy. And sometimes, the most dangerous places were the ones that looked harmless. The fleet moved closer. The coastline slowly became visible. The men could see trees. They could see hills. They could see the shape of the land beneath the afternoon light. No armies appeared. No weapons could be seen. Nothing suggested that danger was waiting. The men began to relax. After everything they had endured, perhaps this would finally be a place where they could rest. They did not know that they were approaching one of the strangest encounters of their entire voyage. They did not know that the danger here would not come with a spear. It would not come with a shield. It would not announce itself with the sound of battle. Instead, it would arrive quietly, through food, through comfort, through forgetfulness. The ships continued toward the shore. Odysseus watched the unfamiliar land. His men prepared to anchor. The journey had carried them far from Troy, far from the Cicones, farther from Ithaca, and now another chapter was waiting. The sea had brought them here, but the sea would not tell them what waited beyond the shore. Only time would reveal that. For now, Odysseus could do what he had always done: watch, think, and move forward, because home was still somewhere beyond the horizon, and until he reached it, he would keep sailing. The new coastline was getting closer. From the deck of his ship, Odysseus watched it carefully. The men had already begun preparing themselves for another landing. After days upon the open sea, the thought of solid ground brought a quiet excitement. But Odysseus did not share their certainty. He had learned something at Ismarus. A shore could look peaceful and still become dangerous. So he waited. The ships moved slowly through the water. The wind had become softer again, and the waves rolled beneath them with a gentle rhythm. For a moment, everything seemed peaceful, almost too peaceful. Odysseus looked toward the distant land. Nothing moved along the coastline. There were no visible armies, no towers, no smoke, no signs of a settlement, only hills, trees, and the pale line of the shore. The sailors continued watching. Some began speaking quietly among themselves. Perhaps they wondered whether they had finally found a safe place to rest. Perhaps they imagined fresh water, fresh food, a few hours on land. After everything they had experienced, even a short rest seemed precious. But Odysseus had another thought. They had been pushed far from their intended route. The storm had carried them away from the waters they knew. They no longer had the same certainty about their position. Every new shore was unfamiliar. Every new wind could change their direction, and the farther they traveled, the more difficult the journey home became. Still, there was nothing to do but continue. The ships approached the coast. Then the wind changed. It happened gradually. At first, only the sailors noticed. The sails shifted. The ropes moved differently. The direction of the waves began to change. A sailor called out. The men adjusted the sails. Odysseus looked toward the horizon. The weather was changing again. The sky that had been clear only a short time before was beginning to gather clouds. Dark shapes appeared in the distance. Not yet a storm, but perhaps the beginning of one. Odysseus gave another order. The men moved quickly. They had learned from the earlier storm. They knew what could happen when the sea turned against them. The ships turned slightly. The coastline remained nearby. But now the question was whether they would be able to reach it. The wind strengthened. The sails pulled hard. The ships leaned into the waves. The men held the ropes. And once again, the sea began deciding where they would go. The wind pushed them away from the coast. The ships drifted. The men tried to correct their course. But the stronger the wind became, the harder it was to maintain control. The waves rose. The sky darkened. The sea changed color beneath the clouds. The peaceful afternoon had disappeared. Now the men were once again surrounded by the restless Mediterranean. Odysseus remained standing. He could hear his men shouting instructions to one another. He could hear the wood of the ships creaking beneath the pressure. He could hear the wind moving through the ropes. But beneath all of those sounds, there was the sea, constant, enormous, unconcerned. The men fought to keep the ships together. They had learned that their greatest strength was not the individual ship, it was the fleet. If the ships remained together, they could help one another. If one became damaged, another could come close. If men fell into the water, others could attempt to rescue them. But the sea did not care about their formation. One enormous wave could push a ship away. One sudden gust could turn a sail. One mistake could create a distance that could never be recovered. Odysseus ordered the men to remain together. They fought the wind. They fought the waves. They fought exhaustion. And slowly, the fleet was carried away from the land. The shore that had seemed so close began to disappear. The men watched helplessly as the coastline became smaller. They had almost reached it. But once again, the sea had taken control. Hours passed. The storm continued. Rain began falling. Water moved across the decks. The men were soaked. Their hands became tired from holding the ropes. Their bodies ached, but they continued. There was no other choice. The only way out was forward. At some point during the storm, the men probably stopped thinking about food. They stopped thinking about rest. They stopped thinking about anything except staying alive. That was the strange rhythm of Odysseus's journey. One moment, the men would be thinking about home. The next, they would be fighting simply to survive. And when the danger passed, they would once again remember that home was still far away. The storm eventually began to weaken. The wind became less violent. The rain grew lighter. The clouds began to break apart. And then, silence returned. Not complete silence. The sea still moved. The sails still creaked. The men still breathed heavily. But the violence was gone. The sky slowly opened. A little sunlight appeared through the clouds. The men looked around. The fleet had survived. But the ships were no longer where they had intended to be. The coastline had disappeared. They were back in open water. And now they were farther from home than before. Some of the men were frustrated. Others were exhausted. A few simply sat down. There was nothing else to do. Odysseus looked across the fleet. He counted the ships. He wanted to know that everyone was still there. One by one, the ships came into view. They had survived. That was enough for the moment. The men began repairing what had been damaged. Ropes were checked. Sails were examined. Water was removed from the decks. Food was divided. The work continued. And once again, life at sea returned. But the storm had taught them something. The journey was no longer following the route they had imagined. The wind had become their master. The sea had become their road. And they were simply passengers upon it. Odysseus could guide the ships, but he could not command the world around them. He could make decisions. He could choose when to stop. He could decide when to leave. He could protect his men from some dangers, but there were other forces he could not control. The sea was one of them, and perhaps the gods were another. The ancient Greeks understood the world differently from us. To them, the sea was not simply water. It was a place where the will of the gods could be felt. A storm could be more than weather. A favorable wind could be more than luck. A strange delay could be more than coincidence. Odysseus lived in a world where the boundaries between nature and the divine were never completely clear, and somewhere beyond the clouds, the gods were watching. Some favored him, others did not. But Odysseus could not see them. He could only see the sea, so he continued. The days became longer. The nights became colder. The men became accustomed to uncertainty. They no longer expected the journey to be easy. They expected the unexpected, and perhaps that was its own kind of preparation, because ahead of them waited challenges that would make the Cicones seem almost ordinary. The sea would carry them toward lands where human rules did not apply. They would meet people who lived in ways completely unfamiliar to them. They would encounter creatures that seemed to belong to another world. And Odysseus would discover that intelligence could sometimes be more important than strength. But none of that had happened yet. For now, they were still simply sailors trying to find their way home. The fleet continued through the changing sea. The wind became gentle again. The sun returned. The waves settled, and slowly the men regained their strength. They began speaking once more. Someone laughed. Someone shared food. Someone told a story. It was a small thing, but it mattered, because after fear, even an ordinary laugh can feel like hope. Odysseus listened. He looked toward his men. They were tired. They had lost friends. They had been carried away from their course, but they were still together. And as long as they were together, there was still a chance to survive, a chance to continue, a chance to see Ithaca again. The sun began to sink. The sky turned gold, then purple, then dark. The first stars appeared. The men prepared for another night at sea. Odysseus stood quietly near the edge of the ship. The water below reflected the stars. The horizon seemed endless, and somewhere beyond that darkness was home. He could not see it. He could not know how long it would take, but he could imagine it. And sometimes imagination is enough to keep a man moving. So the fleet continued into the night. The ships moved quietly through the darkness. The men rested, the sailors watched, and Odysseus remained awake, because the journey was still young. They had already lost men. They had already been driven from their course. They had already learned that the sea could take away their plans, but the greatest challenges were still ahead. The horizon was hiding them, and soon one of those distant mysteries would finally reveal itself. A strange land, a peaceful people, and a temptation unlike anything Odysseus had encountered before. The ships were moving toward it. They did not know its name. They did not know what lived there. They did not know what would happen when they stepped ashore. They only knew one thing. They had to keep moving, because behind them was Troy, and somewhere ahead was Ithaca. Night came gently over the sea. After the storms and the long days of uncertainty, the calmness of the water felt almost unreal. The ships moved quietly beneath the stars. Their sails hung softly in the night air, catching only enough wind to carry the fleet slowly forward. The men had become accustomed to the darkness. They knew how to move around the deck without speaking loudly. They knew where the ropes were kept. They knew how to find their places beneath the sails. And they knew that when the sea was calm, there was little reason to disturb it. So the fleet sailed quietly. Above them, the stars filled the sky. For the ancient sailors, those stars were more than beautiful lights. They were guides. They were familiar points in an unfamiliar world. The men looked toward them and tried to understand where they were. Some remembered the skies above Ithaca. Others remembered the skies above Troy. The same stars had watched them fight. The same stars had watched them leave. And now they watched them travel farther into the unknown. Odysseus stood near the edge of the ship. The wind moved gently around him. He looked across the fleet. The other ships were still there, small silhouettes against the dark sea. Their lights flickered occasionally. The sight gave him comfort. For all the losses they had suffered, the fleet was still together. That mattered. A ship alone in the open sea was vulnerable. A fleet had strength. It could protect itself. It could help the wounded. It could share supplies. And, perhaps most importantly, it reminded every man aboard that he was not alone. Odysseus thought about the men who were no longer there, the men who had died at Troy, the men who had died at Ismarus, the men whose voices he would never hear again. He had become familiar with death, but familiarity does not make death easier. It only teaches a person how to carry it. The sea made those memories strangely close. There was nothing to distract the mind. No crowded city, no battlefield, no walls, only the darkness, the stars, and the sound of water. A man could think for hours on a ship. Perhaps that was why Odysseus often remained awake. His mind was always moving. He was planning, remembering, wondering, thinking about Ithaca, thinking about Penelope, thinking about Telemachus, and thinking about the men who had trusted him. He had promised that they would return home. That promise now carried a heavier weight. At the beginning of the voyage, it had been easy to believe. They had ships, they had supplies, they had experienced sailors, they had survived Troy. What could possibly prevent them from returning? Now they knew. Anything could happen. A storm could appear. An enemy could be waiting. A ship could be damaged. A man could make one careless decision. A strange land could become a trap. The sea itself could change their course. The journey had already taught them that home was not simply a destination. It was something they had to fight to reach. The men slowly fell asleep. One by one, the voices disappeared. The decks became quiet. Only the sailors who were responsible for watching the ships remained awake. The night air was cool. The sea moved beneath them. The stars seemed impossibly distant. And for a while, nothing happened. No storm, no battle, no warning, just peace. Perhaps this was the last completely peaceful night the men would experience for some time. They did not know that. They had no way of knowing. To them, it was simply another night. Another night between Troy and Ithaca. Another night spent waiting for morning. And yet, something was changing. The farther the ships traveled, the stranger their world became. The familiar waters were disappearing behind them. The route home was becoming uncertain. The men were entering places that existed beyond the ordinary world they knew. They were leaving behind the lands of kings and armies. Ahead waited places where old stories seemed to become real. Places where strange peoples lived. Places where the boundaries between humans and monsters were not always clear. Odysseus had not yet seen any of them, but the journey was carrying him closer. The wind slowly shifted during the night. The sailors noticed. They adjusted the sails. The ships changed direction slightly. The fleet continued. As the hours passed, the stars began to fade. The darkness became lighter. A pale line appeared along the horizon. Morning was approaching. The men began waking. Some stretched after sleeping on the hard wooden decks. Others checked the ships. The sailors prepared for another day, and then one of the men noticed something. A faint shape, far ahead. At first, it was almost impossible to see. A thin line against the horizon. Land. The word traveled quietly through the fleet. Men stood. They looked toward the distance. There it was. A coastline. After so many days surrounded by water, the sight of land brought relief. The men gathered along the decks. Some pointed. Others simply stared. They did not know where they were. But they knew what land meant. Food, water, rest, perhaps shelter, perhaps answers. The ships slowly moved toward it. As the sun rose higher, the coastline became clearer. Green hills appeared. The land looked peaceful. There were no walls, no armies, no signs of battle. The shore seemed almost inviting. The men began talking about what they would do once they landed. Some wanted food, others wanted water. Some wanted to simply walk on solid ground again. After so much time at sea, even the earth beneath their feet would feel precious. Odysseus watched the shore carefully. He remembered Ismarus. He remembered what had happened when his men became careless. He would not make the same mistake again. Before allowing everyone to wander inland, he would learn what kind of people lived there. The ships moved closer. The water became shallower. The coastline grew larger. The men could see plants and trees. They could see the shape of the land, but they could not yet see its people. Nothing moved. Nothing warned them. The shore remained silent, and perhaps that silence made the place seem even more mysterious. Odysseus gave instructions. The ships prepared to approach carefully. The men gathered their supplies. The wounded were kept aboard. The sailors prepared the anchors. Everyone waited. The fleet was about to make another landing. But this time, they were entering a world unlike anything they had encountered before. The land ahead was home to a people who did not live like the warriors of Troy. They had no interest in war. They had no desire to conquer. They possessed something far more dangerous to a man trying to return home: forgetfulness. The men did not know it yet. They only saw a peaceful shore. They saw green land. They saw the possibility of food and rest. They saw another opportunity to recover, and so they moved closer. The ships approached the coast. The waves became gentle. The first anchors were prepared. The men looked toward the land. Odysseus stood quietly among them. He had survived Troy. He had escaped the Cicones. He had endured storms. He had watched the fleet being pushed farther and farther from its intended course. And still, he had not given up. Ithaca remained his destination. The memory of home remained alive inside him. But the journey was about to test something deeper than his courage. It was about to test his desire. Because a man can endure pain when he knows what he wants. But what happens when he forgets what he wants? What happens when the memory of home begins to disappear? What happens when a strange land offers peace and asks nothing in return? Odysseus was about to discover the answer. The ships finally reached the unfamiliar shore. The men stepped carefully onto the land. The sea remained behind them. The journey seemed for a moment to have paused, and somewhere beyond the coastline, the people of this strange land were watching. The men of Odysseus had arrived. They did not know the name of the people who lived there. They did not know what they ate. They did not know what customs they followed. They did not know what would happen next. They only knew that they had found land, and after the hardships of the sea, that was enough. Odysseus looked toward the unfamiliar horizon. The morning sun illuminated the hills. The air was warm. The land was quiet. There was no sign of danger. And yet, something about this place would change the journey forever. Not through violence, not through war, not through death, but through a simple desire to stop, to forget, to remain. The journey home had begun with a longing for Ithaca. Now, for the first time, that longing was about to be challenged. And, as Odysseus and his men stepped farther onto the unfamiliar shore, the next chapter of their journey quietly began.